What's going on, everybody? Welcome back to the podcast. Today, I am joined once again by Dr. Dwayne Jackson. We are going to dive into muscle, mitochondria, and what happens as you age in ways that you can support them through training and nutrition. I hope you enjoyed the episode. Today, I want to dive into this notion that muscle is obviously beyond aesthetics, right? Muscle is so important for health. So maybe if you could just talk about the role of muscle and how it's involved in metabolism, and maybe just what happens kind of as we age.
So skeletal muscle is basically one of the biggest organs. It is the biggest organ really in the body. It's if we're healthy, it takes up about 40% of our mass, our body mass, and it's highly metabolic. It's highly regulated by motor nerves, sympathetic nerves, and sensory nerves. And it's very, very vascularized. So being a large tissue and having a lot of blood vessels within it to obviously be able to bring blood to it and take carbon dioxide and all the metabolites away. It's very heavily also involved in blood pressure regulation. So we've got, when we're talking about skeletal muscle as a healthy organ, some of the most important things about it is to be able to maintain its mass over time, but also maintain its metabolic efficiency, flexibility, whatever we want to call it. So overall, when we think about our skeletal muscle, it's really just an amino acid reservoir for health over time. And so as we age, we undergo a process called sarcopenia, and it really starts kicking in heavily in your 50s, but the processes can start even earlier depending on where your overall metabolic health and everything else sits. And sarcopenia is just simply the loss of muscle mass that's really not explained by just activity and all those things that we normally build it up with alone. And so basically it's inevitable that as we push into our 50s, 60s, 70s, that we're going to have some level of muscle loss over time. And so it's really important for us to make sure that we have a good complement of this amino acid reservoir in our younger years, so that as we go into our golden years, so to speak, we have this pool to draw on, and we have the strength to be able to get through any sort of disease states or anything else that we may encounter as we get into those years where those things become more prevalent. So overall, just in a really surface level, if you're not maintaining or at least or building or at least maintaining lean mass over time, especially if you're only in your 30s or 40s, then you might want to start picking up the pace on building some lean mass so that you can go into your older years non-frail, with high performance, so that we can live that whole longevity, health span thing that we want to live out, instead of just a big lifespan where we have a lot of disease, frailty, can't move, can't do the fun things that we want to be able to do when we're, into those older years.
No, that's a great explanation. And in terms of muscle as we age, since there's different fiber types, and some are a bit more dense with mitochondria, some are not. Maybe if you could just touch on what happens as we age. Is there some fiber type switching, and just anything within that topic?
So so as we age, if we're sedentary, the more sedentary we are, we'll say that. And, there's a good correlation between aging and sedentary lifestyle. We start to see fibers shift from more red, oxidative, high mitochondrial dense, highly vascularized tissues to become more and more fast fibers. These type 2 fibers, we call them, or white muscle. And so highly oxidative muscle or slow twitch muscle is very red. And this is what allows us to sustain muscle activity over time. These are our endurance fibers. They're the ones that, kind of play the biggest role in keeping us standing and keeping us moving around. If we are injured, if we have to have extended levels of bed rest from, any sort of disease state or anything else, or just we become quite sedentary, then we will see fiber type shifting to a more white or anaerobic phenotype. And the problem with this is that as we move into these faster fibers, or having a higher complement of these faster fibers, is that the metabolic machinery is a lot different. And so if you think about when you're activating these white fibers, which are the ones that produce the most strength, right? They also produce a lot more metabolite. So lactate is one that people, think about the most, or lactic acid.
Yeah.
And so what ends up happening as we age and we start to get this fiber type shifting from a high mitochondrial aerobic type of muscle fiber to a more white anaerobic fiber, it becomes painful to move. And that's why people will find that they're breathing heavier and they feel pain in their calves and whatnot in their older age as they just climb a simple flight of stairs. And this is a deconditioning state that can be reversed if we, train the muscle to kind of become more shifted over to a red phenotype. Now we need all three fiber types in the body because we do want to be able to, move for long distances, produce some strength and power for longer periods of time, and have explosive power for when we need to, lift the car off of our dog or something if it gets run over. So we do want to make sure we're training all those energy systems, but the default code for the body is to shift toward these white, more anaerobic fibers over time.
And I guess in order to preserve those red fibers, so to speak, it's important to do, say, low intensity cardio as well as high intensity cardio, because I've seen you talk on podcasts and we've talked personally, like how doing zone 2 cardio would be kind of maintaining these mitochondria, and then the HIIT training or high intensity cardio would be kind of pushing these mitochondria and forcing adaptation so that some enzymes have to upregulate. Yep. And they become more efficient, right?
Absolutely. Yeah. So we, when we think about, basically like three modalities of training, if we're thinking about, strength training, we think about high intensity, interval training, so like HIIT training. And then we think about endurance work, which is the long, slow distance stuff. You kind of separate those in those simple baskets. The mitochondrial adaptations that we get generally in all three cases are going to be mitochondrial biogenesis, or more mitochondria per cell. We're also going to get increased, like you mentioned, oxidative enzyme activity, which helps kind of extract energy and make ATP and everything else. And then we also, through all these mechanisms, get more efficient mitochondria in that density. So then they produce more ATP, the energy currency, over time. But the magnitude and type and mechanism of those three modalities, which are pretty different, are also different in producing those effects.
Mm-hmm. Would you say, obviously, I think everybody needs to do more cardio, but would you say 2 to 3 strength training days, 1 to 2, or I guess 1 hour of zone 2 cardio per week, and 30 minutes of HIIT is all that's needed? Or what would you say in terms of like a timeline? Like how many hours a week would you say people need to allocate to each of these?
So first off, we have the whole psychosocial part of this problem. Is that we could, the heavier you train, the harder we go. Maybe we'll do better. But on the other side of the coin, right, we have so if we in a perfect world, right, generally speaking, you want to be able to feed the energy systems appropriately within training sessions. And so when we think about strength training, so the higher end of trying to fire off those type 2X fibers and some type 2 fibers, so those are our relatively non-oxidative fibers, or non-aerobic. We want to be able to be utilizing those, but also in the face of concurrent, or I guess post, after you've trained these fibers, get into some of this long, slow distance stuff where we're pretty much activating slow twitch fibers, the oxidative fibers. And this is funny because in the industry right now, everybody has said like, well, we don't need to do cardio because it doesn't burn a lot of calories, especially long, slow distance stuff, right?
Yeah.
And that's not what cardio, so to speak, was really developed for. The reason why we, generally would put a bout, say a half an hour bout of long, slow distance zone 2 type cardio at the end of an exercise bout that had high intensity and a lot of lactate and enzymatic utilization, is because we want to be able to increase what's called the lactate sink. And George Brooks, a super duper famous exercise physiologist that was, big part of my training and everything else in exercise physiology in the early years. His work really, really promotes this idea of if we keep those slow twitch happy on a regular basis and we feed them lactate over time, and they will chew that up and actually be able to turn that into pyruvate and then make it into acetyl-CoA and then make it into ATP eventually through all those, metabolic mechanisms. Yeah. Then we create what's called a lactate sink. And when we create a lactate sink, then when we go back into subsequent heavy training sessions, be it HIIT or be it strength training, when we're producing lactate, if we're doing lactate, like non-alactic workouts, then that slow twitch is going to chew it up as we're in those training sessions. So we can either get more volume out of the sessions, or we can get more reps out of a given workload. Or when we talk about endurance athletes, it allows them to actually push harder at what we call lactate threshold, which then boosts VO2 max. And VO2 max is kind of the gold standard for aerobic conditioning. So people who are high performance aerobic athletes, runners, cross country skiers, these types of people generally want to have a higher VO2 max. And so that's when, by creating this lactate sink, we can do so. So to give you a timeline, if you're training for 45 minutes at a very, very high intensity, and if you're looking for hypertrophy training where it's not an alactic workout, but it's more lactic than anything else, you're going to start building those, get the burn. That burn, if you do 30 minutes or so of zone 2 cardio afterwards, you'll be chewing up that lactate. Recovery is going to be better, and you're going to be training the lactate to be able to take that up quite well, which is that lactate sink I was talking about.
Yeah. And I think rather than people focusing on, I got to hit this amount of zone 2 per week, just do like 15, 20 minutes on the, whether it's the Stairmaster or, walking on the treadmill or the spin bike, just do that after each workout. And then you don't have to think about like, I got to go back to the gym later. And
you got it, man. Like use it as a cool down. A lot of people use it as a warm up. Hey, nothing wrong with that to kind of fire up energy systems. We can do that. Probably better off doing a quick HIIT training, in my eyes, as a warm up. Right. Yeah. Then move into your either alactic or lactic weight training, and then doing 20 or 30 minutes at zone 2 to chew up all of those metabolites that we just generated during those training sessions. Metabolites, like I said, 1, you're going to recover better, but 2, you're also going to be training those slow twitch to be able to take this up. So it's kind of a double whammy for goodness, if you will.
And I guess in terms of a stress management perspective, you're also bringing your heart rate down after a pretty intense session. So then you're not just hopping in the car right after you get a pump and your ego's inflated and kind of brings you down.
Road rage.
Yeah.
No, I know exactly, Ben. And it's funny because there's a lot of times now, and you probably do have this too. We're busy guys. We got to hop on calls and do all these different things. So we pump out our training session. And then you get on a call and you kind of feel like garbage when you really, when you've really pushed it in those training sessions to failure, and then you don't have this kind of wind down period. And the beauty of, zone 2 training is that you're not heavily activating the sympathetic nervous system. You still are, you're still exercising, your heart rate's still above 100. So we know we're activating that, but you are bringing it back down to a more parasympathetic state. And we do know that there's a sense of relaxation after we do some zone 2 training for, like 20, 30 minutes after a training session. So it's, it's a good use of that time.
And it probably ties into digestion as well. Like say you finish your training session, you don't do your little zone 2 cardio to bring your heart rate back down. You go home immediately, try to eat, you're still in this sympathetic dominant state, and digestion is definitely going to be affected, right?
Absolutely. And it's actually, I did that yesterday. If you overstimulate during your workouts, if you're taking caffeine or stimulant based pre-workout, the problems are even worse. And anybody who's listening to this will be able to agree at some point anyway that when they go home to try and eat and get the food in within that 2-hour window, it's kind of difficult at the beginning because that there's very little blood flow to the splanchnic region to your guts.
Yeah.
And we require that for digestion, but that's where we draw blood from when we're stressed or training. So that's why generally we don't digest well.
Yeah, no, that totally makes sense. So we just kind of touched on training in mitochondria. From a nutrition standpoint, is there anything that you would highlight in order to support these mitochondria, whether it's certain foods or supplements or whatnot? Anything that you'd recommend?
Yeah. So the mitochondria. So right off the bat, the most efficient source of energy extraction is going to come from carbohydrates, especially when we're talking about mitochondria, because those are aerobic machinery. And so being aerobic machinery, then there's a number of systems like, the Krebs cycle and the electron transport chain and all these different things that people talk about that require us to be able to get food substrates like carbs, fats, proteins to become what's called acetyl-CoA. And then that becomes, the substrate that feeds into these systems to become ATP, which is our energy currency at the end of the day. Yeah. And when if we're looking for energy on an ongoing basis to kind of fuel our day, we require carbohydrates the most because those are going to take the least steps to get to that same common final pathway of, the electron transport chain, for example.
Yep.
And so, fats will do the same thing, but they got to undergo beta oxidation and all kinds of other stuff. So they're very inefficient in getting down there. We do want to burn fat if we're trying to get leaner. But if we're talking about, mitochondrial health in general, it's always nice to be able to, have a good metabolic health so that we can burn carbs, because that's going to be our best energy currency. Now, that's to say that when we talk about, carbohydrates and we talk about insulin resistance and metabolic syndrome and obesity states and even non-obese states, this is where we really have problems, because the carbohydrates now are no longer getting to the intracellular machinery that need to take care of them. They stay circulating around in the blood. And when we have that situation, then we start to see mitochondrial dysfunction. And this is when, general exercise, general movement becomes really, really difficult. Yeah. And so, there's no real given generic blanket prescription for here's what to eat. The real key here is to get your metabolic health on point. So get it so your body will assimilate carbohydrates really, really well, and fats. So we call that metabolic flexibility. And by doing so, then that will start to drive mitochondrial health. The key to all this really is that oxidative stress is one of the biggest issues with mitochondria, because they do produce a lot of reactive oxygen species and all these things that are kind of contrary to mitochondrial health. Mm-hmm. So we want to make sure that we're giving the body a supply of good antioxidants and whatnot, and also supporting its own antioxidant system through the glutathione system, so that we can have our mitochondria running efficiently when we can metabolize these carbohydrates and everything else really well. Yeah. So right off the bat, get your metabolic health online first. Make sure that you have good blood glucose levels. Make sure that your lipids are being metabolized properly, and this all will start with having good digestive health. And so when I look at, we kind of go up from the cell into the mouth. It's really a matter of getting yourself on a mixed diet that has a good complement of carbohydrate and fat in it, and then make sure that you're moving to kind of chew that up. And then that will get your metabolic health online so that your mitochondria can do their thing. So notice I didn't say anything about supplements at this point. And that's because the supplement part becomes icing on the cake. And, some of the key supplements that you'd want to have included in there would be things like N-acetylcysteine, right? So that we can, so that's going to produce glutathione, like I mentioned, which is going to help scavenge those free radicals and everything else that are in the body that can blunt mitochondrial function. But also making sure that you're getting enough B vitamins and factors that help with methylation status, because that's really where the magic starts to come in when we're playing with nuances in getting the mitochondria to behave how we want them to do it. But hard training, mixed training, right? So using a variety of HIIT strategies, a variety of zone 2 training, and strength training, those are going to be your biggest rocks to move.
Yep.
And then within that, a very, very healthy mixed diet that does include enough carbohydrates so that we can actually push ourselves during those HIIT training sessions and during our strength training sessions and during our endurance sessions. And then we're basically training the mitochondria during those points. And then we can start getting into things like NMN and NAD plus. And then, then you get into the peptides and everything else that everybody else is doing. But generally speaking, people start with the peptides and they don't get all their big rocks moved. And really that's not the approach you should be taking.
Yeah. They're jumping to peptides and supplements. Meanwhile, they're not eating berries and all the colors of the rainbow. It's
not training the mitochondria, right? Like that's the big thing, like train the mitochondria. Like when you push yourself and you push yourself for extended periods, that's when you're training your mitochondria and you're building more mitochondria. You're making them more dense and you're also increasing the vascularization of the tissues that you're training, the muscle mass. And by doing so, then we can get more efficient delivery of all those, substrates we need for the mitochondria then to produce ATP and take away all that lactate and hydrogen ions and, potassium and everything that breaks down when we're using the muscle. And then we've created a system. And once you've created a system, that's when you start to see the magic of, what you've kind of been trying to achieve. It's not as simple as, grabbing a bunch of vitamin C and hoping for the best.
Exactly. And people don't have to, jump to 4 days a week, do all this cardio. It's like, just start with 1 to 2 strength training sessions, do a bit of walking on the treadmill or spin bike after. Maybe you do 1 day a HIIT, start eating a balanced diet and focus on getting a lot of colors. And that will be your first step. And then you can dive into all, even just more difficult training regimens and supplements and maybe peptides come into conversation, but maybe not.
It's funny because the supplements that we take for mitochondrial health, say like resveratrol and all these different things, right?
Yeah.
They're derived from food. Like the actual science came from understanding why certain populations have, better cardiovascular health, because the heart's also very mitochondrial dense. It's a very aerobic tissue, thank God. So, we don't get a burn in the heart when it's beating hard. So it's a very aerobic tissue. So we really, really want to promote that blood flow, through angiogenesis or sprouting of blood vessels and increased mitochondrial density so that we can really drive the machinery that make it work, in a healthy way.
Yeah, no, that's perfect. I think we've reached our 23 minutes. So I appreciate you hopping on a little podcast with me, and we'll see you again on the podcast soon.
Cheers.